It all started, as these things often do, with a piece of paper. Not a particularly threatening piece of paper at first glance. Just a polite, almost bland notification from the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association, slipped into my mailbox on a Tuesday that was otherwise indistinguishable from any other. I remember I'd just come in from weeding the small herb garden I'd finally gotten around to planting by the side porch, my hands still smelling faintly of rosemary and damp earth. The sun was doing that lovely late afternoon thing, painting the living room gold, and I was looking forward to a quiet evening. Crestwood Hills wasn't a fancy place, not by a long shot. It was the kind of neighborhood where people still waved to each other, where kids left their bikes on the lawn, and where the biggest excitement was usually the annual 4th of July barbecue. I'd bought my little house there about 10 years prior, a cozy 2-bedroom with a porch swing I'd spent countless hours on, just watching the world go by. It was my sanctuary, the one place I felt completely at peace, the reward for years of careful saving and even more careful investing. I'd always been good with numbers, a bit of a financial nerd, truth be told. It wasn't a glamorous skill, not like being a doctor or an artist, but it had served me well, allowed me to build a comfortable, if quiet, life. The letter informed me that I was late on my quarterly HOA dues. $150, plus a $25 late fee. Now, I'm meticulous about my bills. I have spreadsheets. I have calendar reminders. I have a system. So, my first reaction wasn't anger, but a sort of mild confusion. I was sure I'd paid it. I always paid it on the first of the month, like clockwork. I trudged over to my little home office, a converted spare bedroom overflowing with books and filing cabinets, and pulled up my bank statements. And there it was, an electronic transfer to Crestwood Hills HOA, dated correctly, for the exact amount. Clear as day. Ha! I muttered to myself. Must be a clerical error on their end. These things happen. I wasn't about to get worked up over it. The HOA was run by a board of volunteers, mostly retirees with too much time on their hands, and the occasional overzealous newcomer trying to make their mark. Mistakes were bound to occur. I figured a quick phone call would sort it out. Oh, how naive I was. That phone call was my first descent into the bureaucratic rabbit hole that would eventually threaten to swallow my home whole. I found the HOA's contact number, a rather grandly named Community Management Office, which I knew was basically Brenda McIntyre's spare bedroom. Brenda was the current board president, a woman whose primary source of joy seemed to be the meticulous enforcement of rules that nobody else remembered existed, like the precise shade of beige your mailbox was allowed to be. The phone rang 5 times before a harried-sounding voice answered. Crestwood HOA? Brenda speaking. How can I direct your call? As if she were presiding over a multinational corporation. Hi, Brenda, I said, keeping my tone light and friendly. It's Michael Turner from 12 Willow Creek Lane. I just got a notice about overdue dues, but I'm pretty sure I paid them. I have the bank confirmation here. There was a pause, filled with the faint clicking of what I imagined to be furiously typing nails on a keyboard. Turner, you said? Willow Creek. Another pause. Yes. Says here you're overdue. $150, plus the $25 late fee. That'll be $175. Her voice was flat, devoid of any curiosity or willingness to investigate. Right? I said, still patient. But like I said, I have the confirmation. It was paid on the 1st of the month. Bank transfer. Could you maybe double-check your records? Sometimes these things get missed. I could almost hear her sigh through the phone. Sir, our system is very accurate. If it says you haven't paid, then you haven't paid. You'll need to submit the $175 to avoid further penalties. Further penalties? For a mistake that wasn't mine? Brenda, I tried again. Could I perhaps email you a copy of my bank statement showing the transfer? That should clear it up pretty quickly. Another sigh. This one more pronounced. Our policy for disputed payments is that you must submit the payment currently due, and then you can file a formal dispute claim. The dispute committee will review it at the next quarterly meeting. The next quarterly meeting? That was 3 months away, and they wanted me to pay again in the meantime? This was starting to sound less like a clerical error and more like a deliberate shakedown. My initial mild confusion was slowly morphing into a distinct sense of annoyance. I've always believed in handling things calmly and reasonably, but Brenda's stonewalling was testing my limits, even at this early stage. It felt like talking to a poorly programmed robot, one that only had a few pre-recorded lines about policies and penalties. The golden afternoon light in my living room suddenly seemed a little less warm. The polite annoyance I felt after that first phone call with Brenda McIntyre began to curdle into genuine indignation over the next few weeks. I did as she suggested, in the sense that I refused to pay the erroneous amount again, but I did meticulously gather my evidence. I printed out the bank statement highlighting the transfer, wrote a polite but firm letter explaining the situation, and even included a screenshot of the transaction confirmation from my online banking portal. I sent it all via certified mail, return receipt requested, because I already had a sneaking suspicion that "we never received it" would be their next line of defense. The little green card came back a week later, signed for by someone at the HOA's P.O. box. So they had it. Surely, I thought, presented with irrefutable proof, they'd see their mistake, send a quick apology, and we could all move on. I pictured Brenda, maybe even a little sheepishly, realizing her error. How wrong I was. Another 2 weeks crawled by with nothing but silence from the HOA. Then, another envelope arrived. Not an apology, oh no. It was a second notice. This time, the amount had grown. The original phantom $150, the initial $25 late fee, and now, an additional $50 second notice processing fee, and another $25 continued delinquency penalty. My bill was now a ludicrous $250 for dues I had already paid. I immediately called Brenda again. This time, I didn't even get her. I got a voicemail. I left a message, polite but firmer this time, stating I had sent proof of payment, and this continued harassment was unacceptable. No return call. I tried emailing the generic HOA address listed on their outdated website. My email bounced back, mailbox full. Of course it was. The whole operation reeked of incompetence, or worse, a deliberate strategy of frustration. I started talking to a few neighbors. Old Mr. Henderson from across the street, who'd lived in Crestwood Hills since it was built, just shook his head. "Ah, the HOA," he'd sighed. "Used to be about keeping the place nice. Now it's just about the money, son. Watch yourself with Brenda. She's got a bee in her bonnet about something fierce these days." Mrs. Rodriguez, 2 doors down, told me about her own battle over the approved color for her garden gnomes. It was a silly story, but it painted a picture of an HOA board increasingly detached from reality and obsessed with petty power plays. I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I was starting to get angry. This wasn't about $150 or even $250. It was about the principle. It was about the sheer arrogance of an organization that could ignore facts, levy arbitrary fees, and treat homeowners like cash machines. I started to spend my evenings not on my porch swing, but hunched over my computer, researching HOA laws in my state. I learned about their powers but also their limitations and the responsibilities they had to their members. I discovered that they had to follow certain procedures, maintain transparent financial records, and act in good faith. From what I was experiencing, good faith seemed to be a foreign concept to the Crestwood Hills HOA. The more I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just Brenda being difficult. It was systemic. Their website, when I finally found an archived version, was a mess of broken links and outdated documents. The last posted financial statement was 3 years old. That set off a little alarm bell in my head. As someone who understood finances, a 3-year-old statement for an organization handling community funds was a massive red flag. Where was the oversight? Where was the transparency? I was beginning to suspect that my little $150 dispute was a symptom of a much larger problem. And Brenda McIntyre, with her officious tone and her obsession with penalties, was likely at the heart of it. I remembered her campaign for HOA president a year ago. She'd run on a platform of fiscal responsibility and enforcing the covenants to protect our property values. It seemed her idea of fiscal responsibility was to squeeze every last dime out of homeowners, regardless of the legitimacy of the charges. The worst part was the feeling of helplessness they were trying to instill. They wanted me to just give up, pay the inflated fees, and go away. But they were picking on the wrong guy. My quiet life had been disrupted, my sanctuary threatened by bureaucratic bullies, and my background in navigating complex financial situations, usually applied to investments and market analysis, was about to find a new, very personal application. The fight was just beginning, and I was starting to realize it was going to be a much bigger one than I'd initially anticipated. The casual observation period was over. It was time to actively investigate what was really going on within the Crestwood Hills HOA. The next communication from the HOA wasn't a letter. It was a thick packet, delivered again by certified mail. My heart sank a little as I signed for it, the mail carrier giving me a sympathetic look. He'd probably seen his share of these. Inside, amidst a flurry of officious-looking documents, was the bombshell. A notice of intent to lien and foreclose for a debt that now, with more accumulated fees, penalties, and legal processing charges, had ballooned to over $500. $500. And they were threatening to take my house. My house, which was worth hundreds of thousands, which was paid off except for the property taxes I escrowed myself. My house, the physical embodiment of years of hard work and prudent financial management. All because of a $150 fee I had already paid. The shock was a physical blow. I actually had to sit down on the porch steps, the packet trembling in my hands. For a moment, real fear flickered through me. Foreclosure. It's an ugly word. A word that conjures up images of ruin and despair. Could they actually do this? Could a petty tyrant like Brenda McIntyre, armed with the HOA's bylaws, actually seize my home over such a trivial, disputed amount? The audacity was breathtaking. But then, after the initial shock, a different emotion began to surface. A cold, hard anger. This wasn't just incompetence anymore. This was predatory. This was an abuse of power. And I was not going to let it happen. That notice of intent was the catalyst. It propelled me from frustrated homeowner to determined investigator. My evenings were no longer my own. Instead of relaxing with a book, I was poring over HOA documents, state statutes regarding nonprofit corporations and common interest communities, and anything else I could find on the Crestwood Hills HOA. I formally requested, again via certified mail, copies of all financial records for the past 5 years, meeting minutes, current vendor contracts, and a detailed breakdown of the alleged debt they claimed I owed, citing the relevant sections of state law that entitled me to this information. I knew they'd drag their feet, but the formal request started a clock ticking on their legal obligations. I also started really talking to my neighbors, not just casual chats over the fence, but dedicated conversations. I found I wasn't alone in my frustrations. Sarah, a young mother down the street, had been fined for her children's sidewalk chalk art, unapproved exterior decorations. Old man Fitzwilliam, who'd served on the board years ago, told me stories of how things used to be run, with transparency and a genuine sense of community, a stark contrast to the current regime. He mentioned that the HOA had taken out a fairly substantial loan a few years back to renovate the small, rarely used community clubhouse and pool, a project many residents felt was unnecessary and overly extravagant. Never did see a proper accounting of how all that money was spent, he'd mused, stroking his chin. Brenda was treasurer back then, before she became president. Pushed real hard for that renovation. That comment about the loan stuck with me. An HOA with significant debt might be under pressure to maximize income, even through questionable means. This was where my financial background really kicked in. I knew that organizations under financial strain often make desperate, short-sighted decisions. I started to treat the HOA not just as a neighborhood association, but as a financial entity, and I began to analyze its potential weaknesses. I dug into public records, property records, business filings. Most HOAs are registered as nonprofit corporations, and some of their information is publicly accessible if you know where to look. I found the original incorporation documents for Crestwood Hills HOA, the list of past board members, and, crucially, after a lot of searching through county records, I found records related to that clubhouse renovation loan. It was indeed a significant amount, much larger than I would have expected for an HOA of our size. The loan documents themselves weren't fully public, but the lien record was, detailing the lender and the principal amount. The lender wasn't a big bank, which was interesting. It was a smaller, specialized finance company that dealt in commercial real estate and association loans. This was a crucial piece of information, though I didn't yet realize just how crucial it would become. My focus for now was understanding why the HOA was acting with such aggressive desperation. Were they simply trying to make an example of me? Or was there something more pressing driving their actions? The foreclosure threat, while terrifying, also felt like an overreach, a move of profound arrogance or profound desperation. And I was determined to find out which it was, and to use that knowledge to defend my home and, if possible, bring some sanity back to Crestwood Hills. The battle lines were drawn, and I was arming myself with information, the best weapon against bureaucratic bullying. The HOA, true to form, took their sweet time responding to my formal request for financial documents. When the packet finally arrived, just shy of the legal deadline, it was a study in obfuscation. The financial statements were summaries, lacking the detailed breakdowns I'd requested. Meeting minutes were heavily redacted or missing entirely for key periods, especially around the time of the clubhouse renovation loan. It was like they were actively trying to hide something. But even in their carefully curated release, there were nuggets. I saw patterns of increased spending on legal fees and administrative costs that seemed disproportionate for an HOA of our size. The vendor contracts they did provide, particularly for landscaping and pool maintenance, seemed inflated. Were these sweetheart deals? Kickbacks? It was impossible to tell from the limited information, but it certainly smelled fishy. Mr. Fitzwilliam's words about the clubhouse loan echoed in my mind. Brenda McIntyre, as treasurer then president, would have overseen all of this. The picture forming was one of potential mismanagement at best, and something far more deliberate at worst. Perhaps the HOA was genuinely in financial trouble, not because of delinquent homeowners like me, but because of poor decisions and opaque spending by the board itself. This made their aggressive pursuit of my debt seem even more outrageous. They were trying to make homeowners pay for their own incompetence or malfeasance. I spent a weekend cross-referencing the sparse financial data with what little I could glean from public records and whispered conversations with a few more forthcoming and increasingly angry neighbors. One of them, a quiet accountant named David who lived on the next cul-de-sac, had also had a run-in with Brenda over a landscaping violation that cost him a hefty fine. He'd been quietly fuming ever since. When I cautiously shared some of my findings about the HOA's opaque financials, his eyes lit up with a familiar spark of indignation. "I knew it," he'd exclaimed. "I've been saying for months their numbers don't add up. The budget presentations at the annual meetings are a joke." All gloss, no substance. David, it turned out, had also tried to get more detailed financial information and had been similarly stonewalled. We compared notes, and his accounting expertise helped me decipher some of the more convoluted summary sheets the HOA had provided. Together, we started to piece together a troubling narrative. The clubhouse renovation, it seemed, had gone significantly over budget. The loan they'd taken out was at a relatively high interest rate, and the payments were a constant drain on the HOA's resources. It appeared that routine maintenance in other areas of the community was being deferred, presumably to service this debt and cover the inflated administrative and vendor costs. The aggressive fee collection, the ridiculous penalties, the strong-arm tactics. It was all starting to look like a desperate attempt to keep the HOA solvent, to cover up the financial mess that Brenda and perhaps other board members had created. They weren't just power-tripping. They were potentially trying to stave off financial collapse, and they were willing to throw homeowners like me under the bus to do it. This realization hardened my resolve even further. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone in Crestwood Hills who was being nickel and dimed, bullied, and kept in the dark. The HOA was supposed to work for us, the homeowners, not the other way around. Their primary duty was fiduciary responsibility, and from everything I was uncovering, they were failing spectacularly. The foreclosure threat against me was a desperate, ugly tactic, but it was also a symptom of this larger disease. If they were this reckless with me over a paid $150 fee, what else were they capable of? How many other residents had been unfairly targeted, fined, or intimidated into silence? The thought made my blood boil. I continued to dig into the details of that clubhouse loan. I looked up the finance company again, Apex Community Capital, not a household name. They seemed to specialize in loans to HOAs and similar community organizations, often those that might not qualify for prime lending from major banks. Their website was slick, professional, but gave little away. I made a note of the name, filed it away in my rapidly growing dossier on the Crestwood Hills HOA. At this point, it was just another piece of the puzzle, another entity connected to the HOA's precarious financial state. I had no idea then how pivotal that name, Apex Community Capital, would become in my personal battle. For now, my energy was focused on building a defense against the foreclosure, exposing the HOA's mismanagement, and finding a way to hold Brenda McIntyre and her cronies accountable. The more I learned, the more I felt like I was peeling back the layers of an onion, and the core was rotten. It was a late Tuesday evening, much like the one when the first notice had arrived, only now the air in my small office was thick with the aroma of lukewarm coffee and the silent hum of my computer. I was deep in the digital equivalent of a dumpster dive, sifting through online databases, county records, and archived news articles related to niche financial markets. My focus had momentarily shifted from the HOA's internal mess to the external entities they dealt with, specifically Apex Community Capital, the lender for that albatross of a clubhouse loan. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just a vague sense that understanding the lender might offer some leverage or insight. And then I saw it. It wasn't a flashing neon sign, just a name on a list, a detail in a dry financial prospectus. Some years back, as part of diversifying my own investment portfolio, I had, through a managed fund, invested in a package of secured debt instruments. It was one of those things my financial advisor had recommended: relatively low risk, steady returns, nothing exciting. I rarely looked at the specific holdings within these managed funds. I trusted the fund managers to do their due diligence. But something about the name Apex Community Capital had tickled a remote corner of my memory when I first saw it on the HOA's loan documents. So, I'd emailed my fund manager earlier that day, asking for a detailed breakdown of the underlying assets in that particular debt fund. The response had just arrived. I opened the attached spreadsheet, my eyes scanning down a long list of various commercial notes, bonds, and other debt instruments. And there, about halfway down, under a subheading Community Association and Real Estate Notes, was a line item: Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association, loan ID number, original principal amount, current lender of record, Apex Community Capital, servicing agent, beneficial ownership, fund name, my fund, which meant I scrolled back up to the top of the spreadsheet, my heart starting to pound in a way it hadn't since I received the foreclosure notice. The fund was mine. I, Michael Turner, through my investment fund, was a beneficial holder of a significant portion of the debt owed by the Crestwood Hills Homeowners Association. The very same HOA that was trying to foreclose on my house for a disputed $150, which had now, through their absurd machinations, supposedly grown to over $500. The irony was so thick, so utterly unbelievable, that I actually laughed out loud. A short, sharp bark of incredulous laughter that echoed in the quiet room. They were trying to take my house to pay me, or rather, to pay the fund in which I was a major investor. Brenda McIntyre, in her blind arrogance and financial desperation, was unwittingly threatening one of her own significant creditors. The implications began to cascade through my mind. This wasn't just leverage, this was a tactical nuke. The HOA, and specifically Brenda, thought they were the ones holding all the cards, wielding the power of foreclosure like a club. They had no idea that I, their supposed victim, was in a position to exert far greater pressure on them. The clubhouse loan was their Achilles heel, the massive financial burden that was likely driving their predatory behavior. And I, in a roundabout but entirely legal way, held a piece of that heel in my hand. My mind raced. How could I use this? My first instinct wasn't vengeance, though the thought of wiping the smug smirk off Brenda McIntyre's face was undeniably appealing. No, my primary goal was still to protect my home and to bring accountability and transparency to the HOA. This new knowledge gave me a powerful tool to achieve both. I immediately started drafting a plan. This wasn't something to be blurted out at the next HOA meeting. This required careful strategy. I needed to act not as Michael Turner, the aggrieved homeowner, but as a representative of the financial interest holding their debt. It would need to be formal, professional, and utterly undeniable. I thought about legal counsel. While I felt confident in my understanding of the financial aspects, navigating the legalities of this unique situation would be crucial. I knew a lawyer, a sharp woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in contract law and financial disputes. We'd worked together on a couple of complex investment analyses years ago. She was tenacious and meticulous. She would be perfect. The late-night coffee suddenly tasted a lot better. The weariness I'd been feeling for weeks was replaced by a surge of adrenaline, a sense of clarity and purpose. The game had just changed dramatically, and Brenda McIntyre had no idea what was about to hit her. The hunter was about to become the hunted, and the weapon she had chosen to wield against me was about to backfire spectacularly. The next morning, I was on the phone with Sarah Chun. After I laid out the entire situation, the initial bogus fee, the escalating threats, the foreclosure notice, my investigation into the HOA's finances, and finally, the astonishing discovery that I was effectively one of their mortgage holders, there was a long pause on her end. I could almost hear the gears turning in her sharp legal mind. "Michael," she finally said, her voice a mixture of incredulity and professional excitement. This is extraordinary. In all my years, I've never seen a fact pattern quite like this. They're trying to foreclose on a homeowner who is also, indirectly but substantially, their creditor for a much larger sum. The sheer incompetence is staggering. "That's Brenda McIntyre for you?" I replied, a hint of grim satisfaction in my tone. "So, what's our play?" Sarah quickly got down to brass tacks. "First," she said, "we need to formally notify the HOA, through their legal counsel if they have one for this foreclosure action, of the error regarding your dues. We reiterate that the dues were paid, provide the proof again, and demand they cease and desist all foreclosure proceedings immediately. We put them on notice that their actions are baseless and causing you significant distress and potential damages." This was the standard defensive posture. But Sarah had more in mind. "Concurrently," she continued, "but as a separate track, we need to address the matter of the loan. Your fund will need to formally communicate with Apex Community Capital, the loan servicer, and by extension, the HOA. This communication won't be from you personally, but from the fund's authorized representative, which, for this purpose, we can structure appropriately. The communication will express concern over the HOA's current financial stability and governance, particularly citing their engagement in potentially wrongful foreclosure actions which could expose the HOA to significant legal liabilities, thereby jeopardizing their ability to service their debt." Her strategy was brilliant. We would fight their ridiculous foreclosure attempt head-on, while simultaneously, from an entirely different angle, applying pressure as their creditor. The HOA board, especially Brenda, would be getting hit from two sides without initially realizing the connection. I spent the next few days working with Sarah and the administrators of my investment fund. We drafted 2 sets of correspondence. The first was a polite but unyielding letter from Sarah, as my legal counsel, to the HOA's attorney, whose name was on the foreclosure notice, detailing the payment of the dues, the evidence thereof, and demanding the immediate withdrawal of the lien and foreclosure proceedings. It also hinted at potential legal action for damages if they persisted. The second letter was more nuanced. It originated from a newly formed LLC, set up to act as an authorized representative for certain assets within my fund, a standard practice for managing specific debt instruments or engaging in negotiations. This letter was addressed to the CEO of Apex Community Capital, with a carbon copy to the Crestwood Hills HOA Board of Directors. It didn't mention my name or my specific property. It was purely a communication from a concerned creditor. It outlined, in very measured and professional language, that the creditor had become aware of certain governance issues within the Crestwood Hills HOA, including credible reports of aggressive and potentially unlawful collection practices against its members. It stated that such actions could create significant financial liabilities for the HOA, impair its creditworthiness, and ultimately affect its ability to meet its obligations under the existing loan agreement. The letter requested a detailed explanation of the HOA's current financial health, its risk management policies regarding homeowner disputes, and assurances that it was operating in a manner consistent with prudent financial management. It subtly suggested that failure to provide such assurances might compel the creditor to review all available options under the loan agreement, which could include a formal declaration of default if certain covenants were found to be breached. We sent both letters out on the same day. Sarah's letter to the HOA's attorney went via courier and certified mail. The LLC's letter to Apex and the HOA board also went via courier and certified mail. Then we waited. I tried to go about my days normally, but there was an undercurrent of anticipation, a feeling of a storm gathering. I imagined Brenda McIntyre receiving that letter from Apex's direction, a letter from one of her major creditors questioning her board's competence. She wouldn't connect it to me, not yet. She'd see it as another problem, another fire to put out, completely separate from her little crusade against Michael Turner of 12 Willow Creek Lane. The HOA's attorney responded to Sarah's letter within a week. It was a masterpiece of arrogant bluster. It dismissed our claims, reiterated that the dues were outstanding, and stated that the HOA intended to proceed with the foreclosure if the full amount, including all accrued penalties and legal fees, which had now magically climbed to nearly $800, was not paid within 10 days. They were doubling down, completely oblivious. Sarah simply filed their response, a small smile playing on her lips when she called to tell me. "They're walking right into it, Michael," she said. "Their arrogance is our best ally. The real fireworks," I suspected, would come when the HOA board had to respond to the letter from their creditor. That was the bomb with the longer fuse, and I couldn't wait to see the fallout when it finally detonated in Brenda McIntyre's face. The trap was set. The pieces were moving. All I had to do now was maintain my composure and wait for the inevitable implosion. It took about 2 weeks for the tremors from the creditor's letter to visibly shake the foundations of the Crestwood Hills HOA. I heard snippets from neighbors. There were rumors of emergency board meetings being called at odd hours. Brenda McIntyre, usually a fixture at the community mailbox hub, dispensing unsolicited advice on lawn care, was conspicuously absent. When she was seen, she looked stressed, her usual imperious demeanor replaced with a harried, almost frantic energy. David, my accountant neighbor, managed to get a bit of intel from a disgruntled former board member who still had a few contacts. Apparently, the letter from that investment group had thrown the board into a flat-out panic. Apex Community Capital, as the loan servicer, had immediately contacted the HOA demanding an explanation and a plan to address the creditors' concerns. The idea that their major loan could be at risk, that they might be found in default not because they missed a payment, but because of how they were running the HOA, was a nightmare scenario they hadn't anticipated. Their aggressive pursuit of small-dollar delinquencies, a strategy born of desperation and arrogance, was now threatening their single largest financial instrument. The irony was delicious. Brenda, according to the rumors, was trying to downplay the situation, insisting it was just a misunderstanding, a routine inquiry. But other board members, particularly the treasurer, a nervous fellow named Arthur Jenkins who always looked like he was about to apologize for something, were apparently starting to question her leadership. The threat of financial ruin, it seemed, was a powerful motivator for dissent. Then, the official notice arrived. An emergency all-members HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Wednesday evening in the very clubhouse whose renovation loan was now causing so much internal strife. The agenda was vague: to discuss urgent financial matters and board governance. This was it. This was the showdown. Sarah Chun and I had already decided that I would attend, not as a belligerent homeowner, but as a calm, informed resident. The creditor aspect would remain my ace in the hole, to be played only when the moment was absolutely right. Sarah advised me to let Brenda and the board hang themselves with their own rope first. "Let them explain their way out of this mess they've created," she'd said. "Let the other homeowners hear it. Your moment will come." The evening of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting before. The air was thick with tension and curiosity. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew something big was happening. Brenda McIntyre sat at the head table with the other 4 board members. She looked pale and strained, but she tried to project an air of control, her voice a little too loud, a little too brittle as she called the meeting to order. She launched into a rambling, defensive speech about the challenges of managing an HOA, the rising costs, the necessity of enforcing covenants to maintain property values. She vaguely alluded to external inquiries that were perfectly normal and being handled. She never once mentioned the foreclosure actions or the specific concerns raised by their creditor. Then came the Q&A session, and the floodgates opened. One after another, homeowners stood up to voice their frustrations. Mrs. Rodriguez spoke about her gnome fines. David, the accountant, calmly but surgically questioned the lack of transparency in the budget. Others brought up arbitrary rule enforcement, deferred maintenance, and the general unresponsiveness of the board. Brenda grew increasingly flustered, her responses becoming more defensive and dismissive. She tried to shut down questions, claiming they were off-topic, or, based on misinformation. The treasurer, Arthur Jenkins, just kept wiping his brow with a handkerchief, looking like he wished the floor would swallow him. Finally, I raised my hand. Brenda's eyes narrowed when she saw me. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I trust this isn't about your little overdue account, which is a matter for our legal counsel. Not this meeting." A murmur went through the crowd. My little overdue account was fairly common knowledge by now, thanks to the HOA's own aggressive tactics. "Actually, Ms. McIntyre," I said, my voice calm and steady, "it is, in part, because my situation seems to be symptomatic of a larger problem. A problem of aggressive, potentially unlawful collection practices that, as I understand it, have now drawn the attention of the HOA's primary creditor." You could have heard a pin drop. Brenda's face went from pale to a blotchy red. "That is an outrageous accusation," she sputtered. "Our creditors have full confidence in this board." This was my opening, the moment Sarah and I had planned for, the time to play the ace. "Are you sure about that, Ms. McIntyre?" I asked, still calm, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. "Because I have here a copy of a letter sent from a representative of a significant portion of the beneficial ownership of the Apex Community Capital Loan, addressed to your board and to Apex. A letter expressing grave concerns about this HOA's governance, its financial stability, and its reckless legal actions against homeowners, actions like the baseless foreclosure attempt against me for dues I can prove I paid months ago." I held up my copy of the LLC's letter, the one she knew had caused her so much grief. Her eyes darted to the paper in my hand, then back to my face, a flicker of disbelief and dawning horror in her expression. She still hadn't made the full connection. She just saw me, Michael Turner, somehow in possession of this damning internal correspondence. How did you get that?" she stammered, her voice losing its bluster. "That's confidential board business. It's a funny thing about due diligence, Ms. McIntyre," I continued, letting my gaze sweep across the other board members, who now looked utterly stricken, and then to the assembled homeowners, who were leaning forward, captivated. "Sometimes, when you look into things, you find surprising connections. For instance, the investment fund that holds a significant beneficial interest in the Apex Community Capital Loan to this HOA, the one whose representative sent this letter expressing such deep concern over your board's actions." I paused for effect, letting the tension build. Brenda was staring at me, her mouth slightly agape, the pieces visibly, painfully clicking into place in her mind. "Well, Ms. McIntyre," I said, my voice still even but now carrying a distinct edge of steel, "I am a primary investor in that fund. In essence, Ms. McIntyre, while you've been trying to unlawfully foreclose on my home for a few $100s, you've simultaneously been jeopardizing your multimillion-dollar loan with one of your largest creditors. And that creditor is me." The silence in the clubhouse was absolute for a beat. Then a collective gasp rippled through the homeowners. Brenda McIntyre looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Her face, already flushed, went chalk white. Her eyes, wide with shock and dawning comprehension, were locked on mine. The other board members looked equally stunned. Arthur Jenkins, the treasurer, actually dropped his pen. It clattered loudly on the table, the only sound in the room for a moment. Then, the whispers started, quickly growing into a shocked murmur that filled the space. Homeowners were turning to each other, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and, in many cases, dawning, gleeful understanding. The sheer, beautiful, karmic irony of the situation was not lost on them. I let the revelation hang in the air for a moment before continuing, my voice still calm but now imbued with an undeniable authority. "So, Ms. McIntyre, Mr. Jenkins, members of the board," I said, addressing them directly. "It seems we have a few things to discuss. First, the immediate and unequivocal withdrawal of the baseless foreclosure action against my property, along with a full written apology and the expungement of all erroneous fees and penalties from my account." I paused. "That's non-negotiable." Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it again, speechless. It was Arthur Jenkins who finally choked out, "Yes, of course, Mr. Turner. Consider it done. A terrible mistake, a misunderstanding. I'm glad we agree on that," I said, cutting him off smoothly. "Second, this HOA is clearly facing a crisis of governance and financial mismanagement, as evidenced by the concerns raised by my investments representative. We, the homeowners, and indeed your creditors, require full transparency. That means an immediate, independent, forensic audit of the HOA's finances for the past 5 years, with the results to be presented to all members." David, the accountant, visibly straightened in his seat, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. Several other homeowners voiced their approval. "Furthermore," I continued, my gaze sweeping over the stunned board, "given the demonstrated pattern of mismanagement, intimidation, and the potential bringing of the HOA into financial peril, I believe it's time for a change in leadership. I think many homeowners here tonight would agree that the current board has lost our confidence." A chorus of "here, here, and yes," erupted from the audience. Brenda looked like she wanted to disappear. Her reign of petty tyranny was crumbling around her in real time, in the most public way imaginable. "We need a board that is responsible, transparent, and acts in the best interests of all homeowners, not just its own agenda or covering up its own mistakes," I stated. "Therefore, I propose a motion of no confidence in the current board president, Ms. McIntyre, and call for her immediate resignation, along with any other board members who knowingly perpetuated or covered up these issues." The room exploded in applause and shouts of agreement. Brenda shrank back in her chair. The power dynamic had not just shifted. It had been completely inverted. The homeowner she had tried to crush was now dictating terms, backed not only by the righteous anger of her neighbors but by the cold, hard leverage of significant financial power. The rest of the meeting was a blur of stunned capitulation from the board and empowered demands from the homeowners. The foreclosure against me was, of course, verbally and immediately dropped, with profuse apologies from a terrified Arthur Jenkins. The motion for an independent audit was overwhelmingly approved. And before the night was over, facing a tidal wave of homeowner outrage and the undeniable threat to the HOA's financial stability that I represented, Brenda McIntyre, stammering and humiliated, tendered her resignation as president, effective immediately. 2 other board members, known cronies of Brenda's, quickly followed suit. It was a rout. As I walked out of the clubhouse later that evening, into the cool night air, several neighbors clapped me on the shoulder, thanking me, shaking my head in amazement. The fight had been long and stressful, but the victory was incredibly sweet. Justice, it turned out, sometimes arrives in the most unexpected of packages, in this case. A dusty investment portfolio and an overzealous HOA president who picked a fight with the wrong financially savvy homeowner. The days and weeks following that explosive HOA meeting were a whirlwind of activity, but it was a constructive, cleansing whirlwind. The remaining 2 board members, Arthur Jenkins and a quiet woman named Eleanor Vance, who had always seemed uncomfortable with Brenda's aggressive tactics, were shell-shocked but cooperative. They understood very clearly that the old way of doing things was over. With Brenda and her key allies gone, the path was cleared for genuine reform. The first order of business was formally rescinding the foreclosure action against me. Sarah Chun ensured all the paperwork was meticulously correct, leaving no room for future misunderstandings. I received a formal letter of apology from the HOA, signed by Arthur as acting president, and all the ridiculous fees were wiped from my record. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but deeply satisfying nonetheless. The independent forensic audit was commissioned almost immediately. David, my accountant neighbor, volunteered to be part of a small committee of homeowners to oversee the auditors and ensure their independence. The initial findings, which started trickling in a few weeks later, were damning, though not entirely surprising to me. They confirmed rampant mismanagement under Brenda's leadership, inflated no-bid contracts with preferred vendors, some of whom had vague personal connections to former board members, questionable expense reimbursements, and a general lack of proper financial controls around the clubhouse renovation that had led to significant cost overruns. There was no smoking gun of outright embezzlement, at least not yet, but it was a clear picture of incompetence, cronyism, and a cavalier attitude towards the homeowner's money. As for the HOA's loan with Apex Community Capital, my loan, indirectly the creditor representative, my LLC, guided by Sarah Chun, began a formal dialogue with the reconstituted HOA board and Apex. We didn't call in the loan. That wasn't the goal. Instead, we used the leverage to insist on stringent new governance protocols, improved financial reporting standards, and a clear plan for the HOA to get its financial house in order. This included refinancing the existing high-interest clubhouse loan to a more favorable rate, something the previous board had never bothered to explore. Arthur and Eleanor, surprisingly, rose to the occasion. Freed from Brenda's shadow, they seemed genuinely committed to making things right. They worked with the auditors, communicated openly with homeowners, and started implementing the recommended changes. Special elections were held to fill the vacant board seats. Several competent, community-minded individuals stepped forward, including David the accountant, who was elected as the new treasurer by a landslide. I was asked if I would consider running for the board, but I politely declined. I had played my part. Now it was time for others to lead. My role, I felt, was better served as a watchful homeowner, and perhaps a discreetly influential creditor ensuring the new board stayed on the right path. Brenda McIntyre, meanwhile, had vanished from public life in Crestwood Hills. Rumor had it she'd put her house up for sale. She couldn't face the community she had tried to rule with an iron fist, only to have it all blow up in her face so spectacularly. There was no gloating on my part, just a quiet sense of justice served. Her arrogance and her underestimation of a quiet homeowner who just happened to be good with numbers had been her undoing. The community began to heal. The atmosphere at HOA meetings, now chaired by a more collaborative board, became less adversarial and more productive. People started talking to each other again, not just about problems, but about positive ideas for the neighborhood. The oppressive cloud that Brenda's regime had cast over Crestwood Hills slowly began to lift. My little herb garden thrived, and I found myself spending more time on my porch swing, the peace of my sanctuary restored, perhaps even deepened by the knowledge that I had fought for it and won. Life in Crestwood Hills settled into a new, more pleasant rhythm. The reign of HOA terror was definitively over. The new board, with David as treasurer, worked diligently to implement the recommendations from the forensic audit. Transparency became the new buzzword. Detailed financial statements were posted online monthly. Board meetings were well attended, not out of fear, but out of genuine engagement. Homeowners felt heard, and the old US versus them mentality began to fade. The clubhouse loan was successfully refinanced at a much better rate, freeing up significant funds in the HOA budget. This money was then wisely allocated to deferred maintenance projects, repairing sidewalks, upgrading the ancient playground equipment, and even planting some new trees along the main boulevard. Small things, perhaps, but they made a visible difference and boosted community morale. My own life returned to its quiet normalcy, but with a subtle shift. I was no longer just Michael Turner, the quiet guy from 12 Willow Creek Lane. I was, to some, the man who had single-handedly taken down the old HOA regime. It was an odd sort of local fame I hadn't sought, but it came with a newfound respect from my neighbors. People would nod, smile, sometimes stop to chat and thank me again. I always downplayed my role, emphasizing that it was a community effort, but I knew that my unique position as their creditor had been the decisive factor. Occasionally, I would reflect on the whole bizarre episode. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the skills and resources you possess, even those you acquire for entirely different purposes, can become unexpectedly crucial in unforeseen circumstances. My background in finance, my tendency towards meticulous record-keeping, and yes, that one diversified debt fund I'd invested in years ago, had all converged to save my home and, in a way, my community. The lesson, I suppose, was that you should never underestimate anyone, and you should never, ever let bullies, whether they're on the playground or on an HOA board, push you around without a fight, especially when you know you're in the right. As for Brenda McIntyre, the last I heard, she had indeed sold her house, at a slight loss. I was discreetly informed, and moved out of state. There was no public shaming, no perp walk, but her fall from grace in Crestwood Hills was absolute. She became a cautionary tale, a local legend of hubris and downfall. Sometimes, late in the evening, sitting on my porch swing, watching the fireflies dance in the twilight, I'd allow myself a small, satisfied smile. They tried to foreclose on my house. They didn't know I was their mortgage holder. It still sounded like the improbable plot of a movie, but it was my reality. And the resolution was deeply, profoundly satisfying. The peace I felt in my home was sweeter than ever, earned not just with money, but with resilience, a bit of righteous indignation, and the unexpected power of a well-placed investment. And if there's one thing I'd share with anyone facing a similar situation, it's this. Know your rights, gather your facts, and never assume the person you're dealing with holds all the cards. Sometimes, the ace up your sleeve is one you didn't even realize you had until the perfect moment to play it.